The small suburban police station was a cold, unwelcoming place, a stark contrast to the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun outside. The building itself seemed to sag under the weight of its own neglect, peeling paint, flickering fluorescent lights, and a faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant lingering in the air. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unnatural glow on the cracked linoleum floors. The walls were lined with faded posters about community safety and missing pets, their edges curling with age. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. In the corner of the room, Maya Johnson, a 14-year-old black girl with a head full of long, natural curls, sat on a hard plastic chair. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, her backpack resting at her feet. Her chin was held high, but her eyes betrayed her fear and confusion. Tears welled up, threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back, refusing to let anyone see her cry. She had been brought in for what they called a minor misunderstanding, riding her bike through a stop sign. Or so they claimed. But Maya knew better. She had seen the way the officer had looked at her when he pulled her over, his eyes narrowing as if she were a criminal. She had heard the way his voice dripped with condescension when he asked, "You sure this bike is yours, kid?" As if the idea of her owning something so simple was impossible. Now, sitting in the station, she felt the weight of their stares. The officers moved around her like she was invisible, yet their eyes lingered too long. Their whispers just loud enough for her to catch snippets. Another one, just a kid. Waste of time. She clenched her fists tighter, her nails digging into her palms. She wouldn't let them see her break. She wouldn't. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and Officer Greg Thompson stepped out. He was a middle-aged white man with a square jaw and a perpetual sneer. His uniform stretched tight over his broad shoulders. He carried himself with an air of authority, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of cruelty, a hunger for control that made Maya's stomach churn. He walked over to her, his boots clicking loudly against the floor, and leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "So, kid," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "that hair of yours must be heavy. Huh, why don't you just chop it all off? Make your life easier." Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She had learned from her father that sometimes silence was the most powerful weapon. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the clock, its ticking growing louder in her ears. Thompson chuckled, a low, mocking sound that sent a shiver down her spine. He reached out, his fingers brushing against one of her curls. Maya flinched, her body instinctively pulling away, but he grabbed a handful of her hair, his grip firm. "Let's see what's under all this mess," he said, his tone light, almost playful, as if this were some kind of game. Before Maya could react, he pulled out a pair of scissors from his belt. The metallic glint of the blades caught the light, and Maya's heart raced. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, don't." But Thompson didn't stop. The sound of the scissors cutting through her hair was deafening, each snip echoing in the silent room. Maya's hands flew to her head, her eyes wide with shock and horror. Tears streamed down her face, but she refused to scream, refused to give him the satisfaction. The other officers in the room glanced over, some shifting uncomfortably, but no one intervened. One young officer, a woman with short blonde hair, opened her mouth as if to say something, but a sharp look from Thompson silenced her. She looked away, her face flushed with shame. When he was done, Thompson stepped back, admiring his handiwork with a smirk. Maya's curls, once a source of pride and identity, now lay scattered on the floor around her. She felt exposed, violated, but even as the tears streamed down her face, her eyes burned with defiance. She wouldn't let him break her. She wouldn't. Tears streamed down Maya's face as Thompson continued to cut her hair, his laughter echoing in the cold, sterile room. Each snip of the scissors felt like a violation, a deliberate attempt to strip her of her identity. Her curls, which she had spent years nurturing and caring for, now lay scattered on the floor around her, a tangled mess of black coils. She could feel the uneven patches where the blades had hacked away at her hair. The cool air of the station brushing against her scalp in places it never had before. But even as the tears flowed, her eyes burned with defiance. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at Thompson, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her father had always told her, "They can take a lot from you, Maya, but they can't take your spirit unless you let them." Those words echoed in her mind now, a lifeline in the storm of humiliation and anger. Thompson stepped back, admiring his handiwork with a smirk. "There," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Now you look presentable. Maybe next time you'll think twice before breaking the law." Maya's hands trembled as she reached up to touch what was left of her hair. Her fingers brushed against the jagged edges, and a fresh wave of tears threatened to spill over. But she swallowed them down, her jaw tightening. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Maya and Thompson. One of them, a younger officer with a nervous expression, cleared his throat. Greg, don't you think that's enough?" he asked hesitantly. Thompson shot him a glare. "Stay out of it, rookie. This is how we handle troublemakers around here." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Johnson was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting. As a prominent civil rights lawyer, his days were often filled with back-to-back appointments, and today was no exception. He sat at the head of a polished conference table, his sharp suit and confident demeanor commanding the room. His team was discussing a landmark case against a local corporation accused of discriminatory hiring practices, and Marcus was in his element, his voice steady and persuasive. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing when he saw the number. The local police station. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He excused himself from the room, stepping into the hallway to take the call. "Mr. Johnson?" a voice on the other end said, sounding far too casual. "This is Officer Daniels at the precinct. We've got your daughter here. She was involved in a minor incident, and we need you to come down." Marcus's heart sank. "What kind of incident?" he asked, his voice tight. "Just a traffic violation," the officer replied dismissively. "She ran a stop sign on her bike. No big deal, but we need you to come pick her up." Marcus clenched his jaw. He knew better. Maya was a responsible kid. She wouldn't just run a stop sign. And even if she had, bringing her to the station for something so trivial was excessive. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had they harassed her? Had they treated her like a criminal? His hands tightened around the phone. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. His tone clipped. He hung up without waiting for a response, his mind already shifting into overdrive. He grabbed his coat from the rack and strode out of the building, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As he drove to the station, his thoughts were a whirlwind of worry and anger. He had spent his career fighting against systemic injustice, defending those who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. But this was personal. This was his daughter, his little girl. He thought about Maya, her bright smile, her fierce independence. She had always been strong, even as a child. When she was 6, she had stood up to a bully at school who had made fun of her hair. "It's my crown," she had said proudly, her tiny hands on her hips. "And you can't touch it." Now, as he pulled into the parking lot of the police station, Marcus felt a surge of protective anger. Whatever had happened, he would make it right. He would make them pay. Marcus arrived at the station within minutes, his car screeching to a halt in the parking lot. He stepped out, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture radiating authority. The station's automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whir, and he strode inside, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the scene before him. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The station, usually a hub of activity, was eerily quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then he saw her. Maya sat in the corner of the room, her small frame dwarfed by the hard plastic chair. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. But it was her hair, her beautiful, natural curls, once a source of pride, that made his heart stop. It had been hacked unevenly, jagged strands sticking out in all directions. Her face was streaked with tears, but even from across the room, Marcus could see the fire in her eyes. She was hurt, yes, but she wasn't broken. "Dad," Maya whispered as he approached, her voice trembling but laced with a quiet strength. "They did this just to humiliate me." Marcus knelt in front of her, his hands gently cupping her face. His heart ached at the sight of her pain, but he kept his expression calm, his voice steady. "I'm here now, Maya. No one's going to hurt you anymore." She nodded, her lower lip quivering, but she didn't cry. She had already shed enough tears in this place. She nodded, her lower lip quivering, but she didn't cry. She had already shed enough tears in this place. Marcus stood, his tall frame casting a shadow over the room. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the officers who had been standing idly by, their eyes darting away as if they could avoid his scrutiny. Then his eyes landed on Officer Greg Thompson, who was leaning against a desk, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Marcus stepped forward, his voice low but carrying the weight of a storm. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Thompson straightened, his smirk faltering for a moment before he recovered. "Just a little misunderstanding, sir," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Your daughter was being uncooperative. We had to take measures to ensure compliance." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He took another step closer, his presence filling the room. "You call this compliance?" he said, gesturing to Maya's ruined hair. "You call this justice?" Thompson shrugged, his smirk returning. She was resisting. "We have protocols to follow." "Protocols?" Marcus's voice rose, his anger barely contained. "You violated her rights. You humiliated her. And you think you can hide behind your so-called protocols?" Thompson's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. He glanced around the room, as if searching for support, but the other officers avoided his gaze. Even the station captain, Officer Daniels, who had been watching from the sidelines, looked uncomfortable. Marcus stepped closer, his voice like steel. "You think because you wear a badge, you're untouchable? You think you can do whatever you want and get away with it?" Thompson's face flushed, his bravado cracking under Marcus's intensity. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus leaned in, his eyes blazing. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to terrorize and humiliate. And I promise you, Thompson, you will pay for this. I will make sure of it." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Even the buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked uncertain, even afraid. Marcus turned back to Maya, his expression softening. He held out his hand. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home." Maya stood, her small hand gripping his tightly. As they walked toward the door, Marcus paused and looked back at Thompson, his voice cold and final. "This isn't over." Marcus pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate and controlled, though the fire in his eyes betrayed the storm raging inside him. He dialed a number, his voice sharp and commanding as he spoke to his legal team. "I need you here now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bring everything, cameras, recording devices, the works. This isn't just a personal matter anymore. This is about exposing systemic abuse of power." He hung up and turned to the station's captain, Officer Daniels, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Daniels was a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a nervous habit of adjusting his glasses. He had been standing in the corner, his arms crossed, trying to appear authoritative but failing to mask his discomfort. Marcus stepped toward him, his presence towering and unyielding. "This is not just about my daughter," he said, his voice carrying through the room like a thunderclap. Every officer in the station froze, their attention riveted on him. "This is about the culture of this department. This is about the systemic abuse of power that allows officers like Thompson to act with impunity. And I will not rest until justice is served." Daniels swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Mr. Johnson, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. Seriously? Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Daniel's weak attempt at damage control. Your officer just humiliated a child. He violated her rights. And you stood by and did nothing. That's not serious. That's complicity. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face flushed, and he glanced around the room, as if hoping someone would come to his defense. But the other officers avoided his gaze, their expressions a mix of guilt and apprehension. Within minutes, Marcus's legal team arrived, a group of sharp-dressed professionals armed with cameras, recording devices, and an air of quiet determination. They moved with precision, setting up equipment and immediately beginning to document the scene. One of them, a woman named Claire, approached Marcus with a tablet in hand. We've already requested access to the station's security footage, she said, her voice calm but firm. We'll also need statements from everyone present. This is going to be airtight. Marcus nodded, his jaw set. Good. Make sure nothing gets overlooked. Claire and her team fanned out across the station, their presence commanding respect. They began interviewing the officers, their questions pointed and relentless. One by one, the officers shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, their earlier bravado crumbling. Thompson, who had been leaning against the desk with his trademark smirk, now looked visibly shaken. He watched as Claire reviewed the security footage, her expression growing darker with each passing second. The footage clearly showed him cutting Maya's hair, his laughter echoing through the room. It also captured the moment he had grabbed her arm, his face twisted with contempt. Thompson's smirk faded completely, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He turned to Daniels, his voice low and desperate. Captain, you can't let them do this. I was just what? Marcus interrupted, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but the intensity in his eyes was enough to make Thompson flinch. Just doing your job? Just following protocol? No, Thompson, you were abusing your power. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Thompson's face paled, his bravado evaporating. He looked around the room, but no one met his gaze. Even Daniels, who had always been quick to defend his officers, remained silent, his face a mask of resignation. As the legal team continued their work, Marcus turned back to Maya, who had been watching everything with wide eyes. He knelt in front of her, his voice softening. Are you okay, sweetheart? Maya nodded, her chin trembling but her eyes fierce. I'm okay, Dad. But what happens now? Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding and reassuring. Now, we make sure this never happens again. To you, or to anyone else. Maya nodded again, her small hand gripping his tightly. For the first time since she had been brought into the station, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. The police department launched an internal investigation, but Marcus didn't stop there. He knew that an internal probe would only scratch the surface, and he was determined to dig deeper. He called in favors, mobilized his network of civil rights advocates, and ensured that the case would not be swept under the rug. The media had already picked up the story, and the public outcry was growing louder by the day. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #StopPoliceBrutality trended on social media, and protests began to form outside the police station. Marcus stood at the center of it all, a pillar of calm determination. He held a press conference outside the station, the flashing cameras and microphones capturing every word. Reporters crowded around him, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions. But Marcus raised a hand, silencing them with his presence. This is not just about my daughter, he began, his voice steady and resolute. This is about every child, every person of color who has been mistreated by those who are supposed to protect them. This is about a system that allows abuse of power to go unchecked. And this is about holding that system accountable. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. We will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated. And we will not rest until justice is served, not just for Maya, but for every person who has ever been wronged by those in authority. The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus didn't smile. He knew this was only the beginning. The fallout was swift. Officer Greg Thompson was suspended pending the investigation, his badge and gun confiscated. The other officers involved faced disciplinary action, and the station's captain, Officer Daniels, issued a formal apology to Maya and her family. But Marcus knew it wasn't enough. An apology couldn't undo the harm that had been done. It couldn't erase the humiliation Maya had endured or the trauma she would carry with her. Marcus wanted more. He wanted systemic change. He met with city officials, demanding reforms to the police department's training and accountability measures. He pushed for the creation of an independent oversight committee to investigate complaints of misconduct. And he made it clear that he wouldn't stop until every officer who abused their power was held accountable. At home, Maya sat in front of the mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her hair, once a cascade of natural curls, was now short and uneven, a stark reminder of what had happened. She reached up, her fingers brushing against the jagged edges, and sighed. It felt strange, unfamiliar, but she refused to let it define her. Her father stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. He met her gaze in the mirror, his expression soft but unwavering. "Your hair will grow back," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "But your strength and dignity? No one can take that away from you." Maya nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, Dad, but it still hurts." Marcus knelt beside her, his hand covering hers. "I know it does, sweetheart, and it's okay to feel that way. What happened to you was wrong, but you're stronger than they are. You stood up to them, even when they tried to break you, and that's something no one can ever take away." Maya wiped her tears, her chin lifting with determination. "I'm not going to let them win," she said, her voice firm. "I'm going to grow my hair back, and I'm going to be even prouder of it. And I'm going to tell my story, so no one else has to go through this." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's my girl." In the weeks that followed, Maya's story became a rallying cry for change. She and Marcus appeared on talk shows, sharing their experience and calling for accountability. Maya's courage inspired others to come forward with their own stories, and the movement for police reform gained momentum. Marcus continued to push for systemic change, using his platform to advocate for policies that would prevent abuses of power. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew they had already made a difference. Maya's strength had sparked a fire, and it was a fire that wouldn't be easily extinguished. Months later, Maya stood on a stage, addressing a crowd of thousands. Her hair had grown back, her curls as vibrant and full of life as ever. She wore a bright yellow dress, a symbol of hope and resilience, and her voice carried across the crowd with confidence and clarity. "They try to break me," she said, her words echoing through the speakers. "But they failed. And if they come for any of you, remember this: you are not alone. We are stronger together. And together, we can create a world where no one has to live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air. Maya smiled, her heart full of hope for the future. She looked out at the sea of faces, each one a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of community. And she knew, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with her head held high, her curls bouncing, her spirit unbroken.